report from Frank Gunter here. We've just got to wait a minute while everyone logs on, if that's okay. But you have come to the right place. So thank you, everybody. More coming in here. I think probably we're ready to start. We have people sitting in America with Frank. We have people sitting in Jordan with Ahmed. We have people in Iraq and we have people in the UK. So it's quite a nice international audience. Welcome, everybody. Today, we've got a really interesting discussion. Frank Gunter, who is a professor of economics at Lehigh University in America and a member of IBBC's advisory board, has written a report on the de-dollarization and banking system in Iraq called 2 Cheers for Iraq. Some of you may have read this already. If you haven't, it's going to be very interesting. Frank will speak for about 20 minutes, 20 minutes. And then we have our other speaker, Ahmed Tabaqchali, who is, again, the Chief Strategist of AFC Iraq Fund. He's also just recently written an article for the LSE called A Fistful of Dollars. So both of the articles overlap to some extent, but the different nuances from each speaker. So Ahmed will reply to Frank, hopefully in a very courteous way, as always. And then we will have a more extensive discussion. Hopefully, members of the audience might like to also, at that stage, ask a question or two. I feel this may also go into areas of economics and transitional economies and Iraq stock exchanges, very exciting things to come up. So without more ado, oh yes, the other thing is just to say, in case you're not getting enough Frank here, he will be at our Mansion House conference, seemingly sitting on about 3 or 4 panels. So you can catch him live at our Mansion House on the 2nd of July, along with a terrific lineup of Iraqi ministers, the Deputy Minister and Oil Minister, the Agriculture Minister, the Governor of the Central Bank of Iraq, the Deputy Electricity Minister, the Governor of Basra, the KRG ministers. So that's just to name a few, let alone Rupert Soames, who is the head of the CBI in the UK. And we'll be talking about what businesses need from Iraq to trade better and to invest in Iraq. So it's going to be an absolutely terrific conference. There are some seats left. We have over 250 signed up so far, and looking forward to seeing you all there. Without more ado, I'd like to hand over to Frank Gunter, Professor Frank Gunter, who will be talking about his report for the Advisory Council called 2 Cheers for Iraq. Thank you, Frank.
Ashley, thank you. There was a misunderstanding here. You said 20 minutes. I thought you were giving me 3 hours. Wasn't that the original agreement there?
That's just for the conference. Thank you.
Okay, so the point I'm trying to make is that the anti-corruption efforts, the restructuring of the banking system, and the 3-year budget, the 23-25 budget, will all create serious challenges for Iraq's exchange rate. I think everybody who is on this conference call knows the situation. Right now, there's 2 exchange rates. There's the official exchange rate, about 1310 Iraqi dinars per dollar. And then there's the market rate, which has been higher. Yesterday, I think it was about 1460 Iraqi dinars per dollar, which is a 12% gap. The other changes that have happened in the exchange rate in December 2020, the dinar was devalued substantially by 23%. That was mostly driven by the fiscal crisis of 2020, the drop in oil prices. By devaluing the dinar, the Ministry of Finance was able to get more dinars for every dollar of oil money they received. Then, to me, inexplicably, in February 23, there was a revaluation, an increase in the value of the dinar from 1450 to 1310, the current level. That is good news if you're an importer. It's bad news if you're exporting anything other than oil. And the third thing that I think we're all familiar with is that since the dinar has been tied to the dollar has been appreciating, it's been increasing in value. In fact, since February of 2023, when the revaluation occurred, the dollar has gone up about 3.3%. again, making imports cheaper in Iraq and making exports more expensive. Okay, so right now there's two exchange rates, the official exchange rate and the market rate. And what's happening in Iraq is the same thing that's happened in other countries that have had the dual exchange rate. It has slowed economic growth by disrupting existing contracts, excuse me, and by discouraging trade and investment, both trade and investment within Iraq and internationally. The second impact is that it has encouraged corruption. If you can find a way of being paid in dollars and yet making your payments in dinars, then you can benefit from the difference. And the third impact of the dual exchange rate is its complicated fiscal policy. So slowing economic growth, encouraging corruption, and complicating fiscal policy. So why are there two exchange rates? Well, it's basically excessive dollar demand. There's an excessive demand for US dollars internationally. The rial, the Iranian rial, has lost 75% of its value, primarily because of the sanctions from the US and its other nations. Syria, in its civil war, the Syrian pound has lost 99% of its value. So there's entities in Iran and Syria and other countries in the region that are desperate to get dollars, and ideally not electronic funds transfer, but paper dollars, green piece of paper. They're accepted everywhere, and they're impossible to trace. So this has led to a huge demand from Iran and Syria to get Iraqi dollars, because that's a cheaper source of dollars. Less real resources are needed to buy dollars in Iraq than elsewhere in the region. And internally, there's an excessive demand for dollars because until recently, the dollar has dominated the dinar, both as a medium of exchange and as a store of value. Now, some of the recent regulatory changes made since the first of the year have reduced that dominance, but it's still strong. So the excess dollar demand. Another cause of the dual currency is the de-dollarization drive by the United States. When you buy oil, the oil money does not go directly to the Minister of Finance. It goes to the New York Fed to avoid lawsuits. And the New York Fed releases these funds as requested to the Ministry of Finance. Well, until last year, the New York Fed was willing to send either electronic dollars, EFT, or to send actual dollars. There is my signature on a receipt in 2006 for over 300 million US dollars received in Iraq and then transferred to the Ministry of Finance. The New York Fed has now restricted dollar transfers, paper dollar transfers, although they're still allowing the electronic dollars to be transferred. At the same time, over 2 dozen Iraqi banks have been excluded from doing transactions. The New York Fed will not transfer funds to them. The New York Fed will not respect their transactions. So this de-dollarization effort by the New York Fed, the intent was to reduce dollar flows to Iran, to reduce the dollar flows to Syria. Finally, the Iraqi government last year changed the dollar withdrawal rules. If you make a dollar deposit in an Iraqi bank after 1 January 2024, it can only be withdrawn as dinars. Previously, you made a dollar deposit, you could withdraw as dollars. Now, a dollar deposit can only be withdrawn as dinars. So the challenge facing the government of Iraq is to reduce the gap between the official and the market rates in order to eliminate the disadvantages, slow economic growth, discourage corruption, and to make it more rational fiscal policy. So they're trying to reduce the gap between official and market rates by reducing excess domestic and foreign demand for dollars. I think there's been two partial successes. One is in the reduction of corruption. Now, corruption has been reduced in Iraq over an extended period of time, but I don't think it should be overstated. Iraq is now, according to Transparency International, 154th out of the 180 countries in the world that they evaluate. The worst country for corruption being Somalia, the best country being Denmark, but Iraq is 154th. Although progress has been made, I don't think it should be exaggerated. Iraq has gone from being extremely corrupt to being only very corrupt. This is at the grand level, muhasasa, all the way down to the petty corruption. There was a study that showed that the average 35% of Iraqis paid a bribe to a police officer in the last year. So there's corruption at the top, there's corruption at the bottom of the economy. The progress that's been made in reducing corruption has reduced the excess demand for dollars. Directly, many bribes were paid. All the bribes I've been asked to be paid, they requested they be paid in US dollars. So there's a reduction in the direct demand, but also by reducing the corruption, it indirectly, it facilitates trade, it facilitates investment, it reduces the need for dollars to move around to avoid the economy. What are some evidence of the increase of the progress made in reducing corruption? Recoveries are up. 2 years ago, the Commission of Integrity released a report. They recovered 2.3 trillion dinars, $1.7 billion has been recovered. Arrests are up, prosecutions and punishment are up, although, again, not to exaggerate, only 56% of the arrest warrants were actually executed. One reason for that is that 22% of the people were already outside of Iraq. They were charged in absentia. One of the things I think is most interesting is the Commission of Integrity, with the support of the government, has been trying to change the culture. School lessons, including an anti-corruption element, and Friday sermons, including an anti-corruption element. But so far, the government of Iraq has been working on reducing the supply of corrupt acts by bureaucrats, by increasing the rate of arrest, prosecution, and punishment. Maybe there should be more focus on reducing the demand for corrupt acts, the bureaucratic rat's nest that encourages individuals and businesses to pay bribes. Just an example, in Iraq, it takes 51 days to officially transfer a title for a movable property. If your business requires that you need that property transferred before 51 days, then that provides an incentive for corruption. The average for the Middle East and Northern Africa is only 26 days, is half as much. So if Iraq could reduce the time it takes to transfer a title of a movable property, cut it in half, then either less bribes will be paid or maybe zero bribes will be paid. Reducing corruption is a difficult, long-term process that was discussed at length in the IBBC 2021 report, Corruption Worse Than ISIS. But a good start has been made. I said there were three. The second one is to rationalize the banking system, to reduce the excess demand for dollars. Iraq is very much a cash economy. The Central Bank of Iraq estimated that last month there was 90 trillion, now trillion in the sense of a million, there was 90 trillion dinars outside financial intermediaries. Why is cash still king in Iraq? The state-owned banks are the largest, and they're not private sector oriented. As a side note, Rafidan and Rashid, two of the three largest banks, are bankrupt. They have negative net worth. Another reason why cash is still king is that Iraq is severely underbanked. 4 bank branches and 5 ATMs for every 100,000 Iraqis. Compare that to the Middle East and Northern Africa, which is not terribly friendly to banking. In the Middle East and Northern Africa, the average is 14 branches instead of 4 in Iraq, and 37 ATMs instead of 5 in Iraq. Third, the lack of universal core banking, the ability to make a deposit in one branch and withdraw your funds from another branch of the same bank. Progress has been made, especially by some of the private banks, but it is still difficult to withdraw your own funds from a different branch than where you made the deposit. And fourth, I think there's the perception that deposits have become more insecure. As we just talked about, in January 1st, there was a suspension of dollar withdrawals. In December 2020, you had the 23% devaluation of the dinar. And I was surprised in Baghdad that several of the people I talked to raised the issue of what happened in Lebanon in 2019, where the Lebanese government froze all bank accounts and made it very difficult to withdraw, something that the government of Iraq has done for withdrawal from in foreign ATMs. So for these reasons, the suspension of dollar withdrawals, the devaluation, and the possibility that in a crisis, Iraq will follow the path of Lebanon and freeze bank accounts, have made deposits seem more insecure. So progress has been made. What can be done? First of all, allow foreign banks, and the foreign banks are doing more business in Iraq. E-banking, about 90% of Iraqis have smartphones, have cell phones. About 50% of those phones are smartphones that can be used for e-banking, and some progress has been made there. The recapitalization of Rafidan and Rashid, and moving towards universal core banking would all have the effect of improving the dinar as a medium of exchange and reducing the demand, the domestic demand for dollars. To improve the dinar as a store of value, deposit insurance for private banks. It is difficult to do well, but I think it's essential. And improve the quality of the income statements and the balance sheets of Iraqi companies that are in the ISX, that are in the Iraqi Stock Exchange, to increase the confidence that investors will have. My successor in this presentation, Dr. Tabaqchali, will probably be able to talk about this issue at greater length. I said two pieces of good news. One is reducing corruption, and progress has been made. The other is rationalizing the banking system. The third is I think we have to be pessimistic. The 23-25 budget is extremely aggressive. An increase in current expenditures of 22%, mostly for salaries and pensions, and a return to Iraq being the government being the employer of first resort. Under Saddam and until 2014, the government of Iraq deliberately created government jobs, at least enough government jobs for the college graduates. That stopped in 2014, first of all, because of the fall in oil prices, but secondly, because of the fight against ISIS. Well, in the 2003-2025 budget, it was restored. An estimated, the budget plans, I don't know if it's actually going to occur, increase in government employment by 705,000 new employees. The country is already over government employment, and this would make the situation worse. On the investment side, the 3-year budget calls for a 54% increase in oil and non-oil investments. Revenues, the revenue assumption was conservative, $70 per barrel, 3.5 million barrels per day. Unfortunately, with the aggressive increase in expenditures, the World Bank estimates that Iraq doesn't need $70 a barrel. They need $90 a barrel in order to close the budget gap. Now, we're talking about the dollars actually received by Iraq. If you want to convert that to Brent blends, $90 received by Iraq is what? $98 Brent blend. So what is the price of oil going to be over the next 3 years? Well, that's a way of being foolish, but I look at the futures market where you have people actually investing their own money, actually gambling their own funds on what they expect the price of oil to be. And if you look at the futures market, the expectation is a decline in oil prices. $86 Brent blend this year, $81 in 25, $76 in 26. So the World Bank looks at the requirement for $90 per barrel, the very aggressive increase in expenditures. At the same time, oil prices are declining, and the expectation is an increase in government deficits, federal government deficits, 1.3, 7.6, finally ending up at 8.8%. In the past, in the 2020 crisis, the central bank sold bonds to the banking system, and the banks then resold those bonds to the central bank, monetizing the debt. This leads to a decline in the hard currency reserves of the central bank, and in 2020 eventually led to a decline, devaluation of the dinar. So two cheers, the anti-corruption and the banking restructuring should reduce the gap between the official and the market exchange rates. But I think we have to be concerned about the growing deficit and the decreasing international reserves will widen the gap between the official and the market rate, possibly leading to another foreign exchange crisis similar to that of 2020. Ashley, I think you owe me a cigar. That's exactly 20 minutes.
Thank you very much indeed, Frank. And I hope you had a good coffee this morning. It's probably about 5 in the morning there. With that, tour de force, I'd like to hand over to Ahmed Tabaqchali to respond and to also put your point of view as well. Thank you, Ahmed.
Well, thank you for that. And you're right, Frank got exactly 20 minutes. So that leaves me about 2.5 hours to his time slot. And I'll fill you up on that. Well, first of all, thank you all for the invitation. And it's always a pleasure to share a platform with Frank. We've shared many platforms in the past, and it's always a pleasure. I got to know him from before. Now, interesting thing is, I think, on the way we look at things is, we approach things, I think from everything I've seen in the past and currently, we tend to have similar views on so many things, but we approach them quite differently, in the sense that Frank is a real economist. I am a mathematician and a market practitioner. So I look at stuff at a very different perspective. As a mathematician, I look at the structural issues behind anything. As a market practitioner, I've been in equity since the early 90s. And so I learned economics, as I explained to you earlier, standing on my head. So I always see an event, see something, and try to understand it. So it's all sort of been learned. So anyway, it comes to the exchange rate. So how does it work? For me, in a way, when I look at the issues raised by Frank, and whenever it comes to looking at the currency, basically you look at the dollar demand supply dynamics, as well as the exchange rate between the official and the unofficial. Sorry, the official and the dollar, and versus the parallel market rate. Now, the thing is, the way I look at it is that these are a direct consequence of the two structural imbalances, or of the key structural imbalances of Iraq's economy. So Frank, in a sense, warned about 2020 budget and so forth. Well, the thing is, it's the same structural imbalances that have plagued us and have defined our country since actually the 70s and onwards. But obviously, in 2003, it took a faster approach towards that, and that's when we had the 2020 crisis. So, what are these basically? Well, the essence basically is our only export, or pretty much 95 plus, depending on the price of oil, is oil exports. On the other hand, our economy is driven by the state. The state accounts for everything either as the driver, an employer of the largest segment of the country, as well as a driver of the non-oil economy. The upshot of it is that we have a very small and a very tiny traded goods and services sectors, which means all domestic supply, all domestic consumption pretty much is satisfied by imports. And imports are mostly done by the private sector, and for the most of it is informal. So that brings us to what we have as the auction. And why do we need the auction, and what role it plays? Because basically the only source for dollars is the government oil revenues, and the only demand for dollars, or the bulk of the demand for dollars, comes from the private sector, which is mostly informal. Now, the auction was created as a mechanism to ensure that the private has access to dollars, and also to ensure that Iraq complies in a way with its obligations with the IMF under the articles of the IMF, which is Article 8, I think, which requires that you keep a single exchange rate, at least for the import-export, or what's called the current account. And so therefore, we have a small banking sector. So in a sense, the only way that we can get what's called a unified exchange rate, i.e. when the parallel and the official rate are within 2%, is through the auction. Now, this is really where the complexities happen and where all the issues of the difference between the parallel and the official rate happens. Because basically, in a sense, what you're looking for is the informal sector accessing the auction through the formal banking system, which basically makes no sense whatsoever because the informal sector basically is unregistered. So how does an unregistered sector access the formal thing? What means basically is that not every demand can be satisfied by the auction, and not every demand meets the auction's requirement. One of the auction requirement is to comply with all the anti-money laundering and so forth rules, as well as source of funds. So you don't have to be, let's say, a corrupt business to access it, to be denied access. But if you're informal, basically you don't have source of funds, you don't have proof of almost everything that's needed there. And that's what means. So basically it means that you have a demand for dollars that is not met at the official exchange rate. And that's where you have the differences between the two. Now, if you look at the difference between the two, forget the last year or so, I'll come to that in a minute. The difference between the two has mostly been around 2% from 2012 when we had a period of stability, especially, for example, like let's say from mid-2018 all the way to about end of 2020 or thereabouts. It spikes when you have an issue either with supply or with demand. So in 2015, 2016, 17, we had an issue because we didn't have enough dollars. That's when we had the Daesh conflict and the fallen oil prices. So the CBI restricted the availability of dollars. Then what we have is the current issue. So what happened? The basic issue changes that Frank refers to, basically these happened in November 2022. What they meant really basically is it's been an ongoing process between the CBI, the Fed, the Treasury, and the Ministry of Finance over the years to bring the Iraqi banking system pretty much in line with the globe. One of the last changes to take place was supposed to take place in 2020. Obviously, with COVID and all of that, that was delayed. That was implemented in 2022. What had really happened basically in that is people have made a lot of sort of like speculations and a lot of stuff, and mostly, and Iraq being a country, we subscribe to a ton of conspiracy theories. The basic thing what changed in all of with the auction is the sequences of the information provided when you access the auction. So basically, when you access the auction, you access them through the bank, through any bank that is registered and so forth, and you submit your documents, which basically shows a bill of sale, all the bits and pieces that go with it. In the past, that was paper-based, that was manual, and also the inspection or the data used to happen after the transfer was sent. So what happened is the change in sequences, not in the provision of data. In the current setup, which is in line with what happens everywhere, all the data about the ultimate beneficiary and the ultimate sender is available to everybody on the chain, which created a de facto sanctioning mechanism on any transaction that is not fully, let's say, compliant with the anti-money laundering, with the financing of terrorism and all that kind of stuff, gets closed. So what means basically is everybody started looking at sort of suspicious activities, but mostly almost all the activities that were done by the informal sector, which they've used roundabout ways, which I've described in detail in my piece on the dollar auction, on the dollar piece, and that's basically explains sort of how it goes. But basically, the used to go a roundabout way to access the auction, lost that. So what did that happen? That created a huge demand for dollars outside the formal mechanism, and that in a way created a demand. So basically, the demand couldn't be satisfied at the auction. It had to be satisfied outside, and bingo, we had a massive demand, and therefore you see the rise in the premium between the official and the unofficial rate. And by the way, the premium that you see, everybody sees, and I'm not going to bore people with details because I find those absolutely fascinating, but most people fall asleep if I go more than 2 or 3 minutes discussing them. But the rate that you see is the cash rate, not the transfer rate. The CBI initially made available, so what happens is transfer volumes drop something like 70, 80%, while cash volumes increase substantially, long story short, the huge difference, which peaked at somewhere around 29% or 28%, that created the incentives. As a market participant, I believe in incentives for the informal sector to access formality. So what happens, the informal sector began to transform to formality. Now with formality, what happens, it comes with disclosure, it comes with paper trail, it comes with paying taxes, paying all the stuff that they've avoided in the past. But at 29% premium, that makes that quite cheap. And so what happens is they started all becoming formal and going through the formal mechanism of accessing the auction. What we have today is, you see the figure that Frank quoted, we're like up about 12%. What that tells you, by the way, if you look at supply demand, is that more and more demand is being supplied through the auction or through the formal mechanism, or that demand is weakened, because we don't know. We only know demand-supply mismatch. Now, what did that do to the country? And that's what I discussed with you earlier, in a sense. What did that do? For us, and all the things that were mentioned earlier were absolutely transformational. Because what you look for, basically, in these companies, as they began to access formality. Now, accessing formality is a long-term process. It doesn't happen in a day. Company registration, the data, and given our bureaucracy, which, by the way, I would recommend that you read a lot of Frank's prior work on that. Our bureaucracy is actually painful. I mean, as bureaucracy is absolutely painful, which means that formality is a very, very lengthy process. But it started happening. And what you see, for example, is the number of account openings shot up significantly in 23 over 24. The number of card issues, so basically we're talking prepaid card, debit card, credit card, exploded year over year. The number of points of sales that are available went through the roof. I mean, we're talking from a small base, by the way. So, it's starting from low levels. Also, the volumes of transactions on the card have increased substantially. They were driven by those, but also by the policies of the government to create demand for Iraqi dinar. So, in a sense, in every country, the demand for the currency mostly comes from the government, in which you pay your taxes by your local currency. In Iraq, we didn't have that. We didn't have many, many things. So salaries, people were entering contracts in which salaries are in US dollars. It makes no sense. We used to pay, even for Iraqi Airways, traveling within Iraq, in US dollars. As Frank mentioned in his paper, when you come to get a visa, you pay in US dollars. So the government, early in 23, started up two things which were transformational. One is required all settlement of goods and services in Iraq to be in Iraqi dinar. Now, obviously, some people don't like that because it means a change in their income, but that change in the income can be both ways. If the currency is revalued, then they benefit. If the currency is devalued, I mean, so it's, you can't look at it as a loss. You were being paid in a currency not of your country's currency. So therefore, if you are working in Iraq, you get paid in Iraqi dinars. That's normal, like everywhere else. So that created stuff. Also, the government started pushing for payments of its goods and services in points of sale. So for the government initiated a huge drive for all government services to be paid for in dinar. So one of the ones that is fairly, people that were discussing it is, for example, oil. Petrol. If you pay for petrol and processed refined petrol goods at service stations, you get those in Iraqi, in points of sale. That created a huge demand for that. And what happened all of a sudden is that you're seeing a transformation of banking that is sort of, in a way, for me as an investor in Iraq, is something that I was looking for. I expected it to take a long time in the making because these things are almost like a hockey stick. So what you have is years and years of low adoption, and then suddenly you have an explosion. I think we are at the cusp of that. And you can see it in all the volumes. I'll be writing a piece for Iraq Business News fairly shortly, and you'll see the figures on all of these. And what it made basically is, because the transfers now are done all through the formal channels, the banks that have international correspondent banking relationships, these banks were already strong. They were already experienced a transformation that began in 2018. So, for those who don't know, we had a banking crisis. In the sense when bad debts exploded at the onset of the Daesh conflict. the banking sector went through a 2 or 3 year period of enormous pain. The stronger banks became very strong, and their earnings began to transform from 2018 onwards. They got a massive shot in the arm last year. So 3 of the top banks in the country, their year-over-year earnings growth, so we're talking after-tax growth of more than 200%. One of them was almost 600%. So in a sense, that gives you the sense of how far it goes. With the changes that are taking place, with the use of electronic payments, i.e. we're using cards and we're using e-wallets and we're using more and more banks for settlement, which means cash is becoming less and less of a factor. It's still a basic large factor. The figure that Frank quoted you in the sense of the percentage of the currency that's outside the banking system, it's always been in the 90% figure. It's always been still relatively at 90%, but I expect that to go down in time with the adoption of banking. And with that, you can have the transformation of Iraq's economy that hasn't happened before. So in a sense, there was a crisis, but both market incentives as well as the correct measures by the government and by the central bank have alleviated a lot of that. Finally, I share with Frank, the main issue is the budget, irrespective of its size, basically it's the same budget that we've had in all the past, in which current expenditures, i.e. salaries, pensions, are way above what is investment spending, which is what is needed. That, in a sense, what happens is every time you increase those expenditures, and we increase them every time, which means basically you increase the burden on the state. So to give in a sense of how big that burden is, if you look at salaries and pensions as a percentage of oil revenues, and I'm talking gross oil revenues, so I'm not even talking net oil revenues after we pay for the extraction of oil, I'm just looking at gross. These figures were around 60%, I think, of oil revenues in the financial crisis, which is basically 2007 and 8. They became more like 88% during the Daesh years, and they were like almost 100% in 2020. So in a sense, we are dependent on oil revenues to keep that going. Luckily, I think for us, in a sense, the current outlook for oil prices is benign, which means we should be okay for the next number of years, gives us the opportunity to correct the imbalances if we act on that. The budget is fairly high, but as historically we are poor in fairly executing the budget, which means basically the $90 that Franklin talks about, it's based on theoretical expenditures, of which hardly ever happen. But it means that the break even is high. And I think with that, let me end it. I think I've taken 20 minutes? Yeah, something like that, or 18. And I'm starting to cough, so I should leave it right now and open it to questions and other bits.
Thank you very much indeed, Ahmed. Frank, did you want to just respond to that at all? Amplify before we open up, and I might even ask a question.
Oh no, I don't think so. Every time I read one of Ahmed's papers or hear his presentation, I learn, and this was no difference. One thing, yes, if I could, you talked about 200% after-tax earnings. Now we're talking several private banks, right?
Commercial banks, yes. State banks haven't published their figures, yeah. I mean, the thing is, by the way, you're quite right on the state banks. They're old monoliths. They don't have a core banking system until recently. They began to implement it. All the private sector banks, pretty much all of them, have a core banking system which functions, but these two still dominate the banking system, and they don't really function properly like commercial banks. They function more like they as the IMF notes, they do almost quasi-treasury operations.
Yeah. Okay, thank you. If I could just, from my own perspective, I think I know the answer, but if I could ask you if you think the government of Iraq is on the right track at the moment, and if they're not, how would you like to modify that? Frank, would you like to?
Well, I think that, I like the progress that's been made as an outsider against corruption, and the banking, the rationalization of the banking system is good. But the fiscal, when I was in in Baghdad, I went down to the station, and which is the entrepreneurship incubator in Baghdad. I think there's another one up in Erbil, the ARC. And yeah. And one of the things that talking to some of the young people there, that they'd given up on the idea that, like their uncles, like their dads, that they were going to get a government job, because we had gone from 2014 to 2021 with very few government jobs being created. That to me was an optimistic thing, and I think that the budget of 23-25, and as was just mentioned, the execution can be very different than the amount budgeted. But to go back to the government creating government jobs in an already overmanned, I think has to be a very pessimistic thing. The data seems to show the government employees are paid more than people with equivalent skills in the private sector. They have a good retirement plan, they have a pension, and the work intensity is less. So the idea that Iraq can continue into the future of selling oil, crude oil, and using that to create government jobs is the wrong direction. And I'm really surprised that they've reversed themselves and become the employer of first resort.
Thank you. Ahmed.
Well, once again, I can't help but agree with Frank in a way. I think it's very, very healthy that the younger generation is not looking for government jobs. Mm-hmm. The thing is, the issue with agreeing or not with the government policies, I happen to fully agree with the measures taken, for example, that create structurally change. Because as I said to you, I'm a structuralist. So for me, changing the dynamics of demand, i.e. create demand for dinars, that's essential. Every government creates its own demand for its own currency. That I think is very important. The fact that they're going on points of sale, on electronic banking, these are all the right measures, irrespective of how well they're implemented. That once you begin to implement them, you create the structure in which by corruption gets closed. I.e., once we all make payments online, once we apply, almost everywhere that you're looking for, you're seeing one of the benefits that Iraq is enjoying, which is basically the relative stability we've had over the last few years. It's making everything more predictable. Those of you who've come to Baghdad, if you won't believe the transformation that the city is going through, both on the private sector investments, which basically means the private sector is confident, or at least is comfortable with making predictions or expectations for what they can make in the next few years, as well as the government. We are seeing a transformation of Baghdad. The last time we've seen something like that was in the 80s. So it's all the right stuff. I happen to disagree with how we as a culture approach these things. We approach them more through the stick. I am more of a carrot person, because I believe, in a sense, that creating penalties isn't fair. Although I'm all in favor of them, they are not the solution. The solution is incentives. Because I honestly believe that people, irrespective of whether they are in the Middle East, wherever they are, I mean, people say the Middle East is different. No, people and businesses are always rational and always act in accordance with their benefits. So if you create the incentives for change, they will be far more longer lasting than just looking at the stick element. And yes, the government jobs, by the way, even finally, just to add to Frank, even if oil price is $100 plus for the next 20 years or more, our population growth will outstrip our ability to even go with that. So, oil prices are not going to stay the same. We are going to be in the oil game for the next 20 years or so, given the fact that we're one of the cheapest producers, but there's going to be less and less oil sold. So ultimately be less demand, ultimately less prices. So.
Thank you very much. Probably a good opportunity to say if anybody would like to ask a question. If you could try and raise a hand, and hopefully we can access you there. Looking around for hands here. Doesn't look like it. I can't see any hands at the moment, but while you're thinking about it, Ahmed, can I just ask you? But your fund is doing pretty well at the moment, isn't it? I mean, that's a stock exchange fund, isn't it?
Yeah, well, let me allow you to do some sort of like a party political broadcast, since we are in the UK elections here. Now, yes, I mean, as you know, that I, with working with Asia Frontier Capital, launched the AFC Iraq Fund in the middle of 2015. And it was predicated basically on the assumption or the thing that as Iraq moves from conflict towards restructuring, you'll see a transformation of the economy. One of it was going to be taking place in the banking sector, and the things I explained to you are, brought the time horizon forward by a couple of years. So last year, we were up as a fund, something like 110%, which according to our research places us probably the best fund of its kind. And I'm really saying it's kind because we're talking about generalist, unhedged, unleveraged, non-specialist. So you can't compare the fund, let's say, to a fund that looks into Bitcoin. But if you look at generalist funds, we are probably the best fund in the world. And year to date, we're up about 20%. And mostly what's happening is we're riding the transformation that is taking place in the country.
I think that's the key thing.
I do see a hand up.
Yeah, absolutely. So William Holden, would you like to ask a question and unmute yourself, please?
Cheers, thank you, Ashley. Yeah, so Will Holden here. I'm actually from Dublin in Ireland. I've spent nearly 10 years in Iraq. I'm actually presently in North Syria at the moment, working on a humanitarian project with a US organization, actually. But my background is supply chain logistics, and one of the things I've learned over the last decade or so is the dearth of supply chain logistics and procurement training within Iraq and Syria. And this is sort of my specific area of interest. And it was something I tried to develop prior to COVID, and then COVID put paid to everything, but we're going to restart again. So I'll be back in Erbil and Baghdad the end of July into August and doing some good old-fashioned business development in that area. But one thing which is always on my mind is the diversification of the business in Iraq. I know, like, as I said, I'm only 10 years here, so I have a lot to learn. But I just think, I understand, I saw the SME publication there recently as well, which there was a discussion about the diversification of industry in Iraq. But I just think this should be much more prevalent. It should be part of every conversation. Because oil industry, as we all know, it is what it is. But there's just so many opportunities. I keep saying this. There's so many opportunities for building new industries, and whether it's training and development, which is my specific interest. I actually took part in a separate webinar only this morning with an Irish, very interesting Irish business who are developing virtual reality training for the life science industry, which is I've never seen anything like this before. It's absolutely amazing innovation and so on. What I'm saying is that there's so many young people I get to know. There's so much ideas and opportunity. There's no opportunities really, but we're looking for the opportunities for Iraq. As I said, I'm there a long time. I've got my Iraq head on, or the Kurdish head on, as the guys say. And I'd like to fight that corner for the young kids in Iraq and Kurdistan.
Thank you, William.
So,
Frank.
Yes, the diversification from oil is essential. You have the expectation oil prices are going to go down. You have the very rapid population growth. Iraq is now 44.5 million. That's almost twice of what it was in 2003. Diversification is essential. The biggest barrier, and again, this is probably an economist speaking, the biggest barrier is the regulatory environment for private sector businesses in Iraq might best be described as hostile. To start a new business, to get credit, to resolve a bankruptcy is extremely difficult. Unfortunately, the World Bank no longer publishes its international comparison of ease of doing business. But when they did, Iraq was tied for worst in the Middle East in category after category. And that is something that can be changed. It could be changed by either adopting the best practices commercial code of the World Bank, or if you're uncomfortable going that direction, it could be changed by adopting the commercial code of, say, the Emirates, which is not perfect, but it is much more supportive of the private sector. So I think there's a lot can be done. Now, is progress being made? Yes, but it looks like it's going to take decades, and Iraq doesn't have decades. So a rationalization of the regulatory environment, make it more friendly towards the private sector, I think would definitely help towards diversification from oil dependency. Thank you.
Thank you. Ahmed, did you want to comment at all?
Yeah, I mean, once again, I'm going to agree with Frank, but the thing is, I would divert in one way, in the sense that there is another difficulty which is quite massive for any oil-based economy, and that's the Dutch disease. In the sense that the value of our currency, I mean, if you look at it, basically, yes, we do have a great deal of negatives in terms of our business environment, access to credit. All of these things are, significant negatives, no doubt about it. However, in every part of the world, businesses have adapted to these. So Iraq is no different, really, in a way, as hostile as it is, no different than many other parts of the world. But the issue comes in with one thing that you can't really compete with, and that's, for me, is a very long term. It's the value of our currency. Because it's pegged to the dollar, in a sense, and it's pegged at wherever it is right now, whether it's 13.10 or 14.50. If you look at our three largest trading partners, which are basically China, Iran as China, followed by Turkey, followed by Iran, which between them, they account for something like 60% of our private sector imports, or more, actually, probably more like, I would say, in the 70% of our private sector imports. Their currencies, especially Iran and Turkey, for various reasons, their currencies are exceptionally weak against the dollar, so they're thus with China, obviously, the issue with the US and China, which is always that the US believes that China's currency is kept high. Either way, it has depreciated versus the dollar, which means our currency becomes very, very difficult for our businesses to compete with the outside world, and that creates a difficulty for a traded goods sector. So that's something that I think will take a lot longer to diversify. And finally, I would say on the Middle East, everybody talks, especially when all economies, and says about diversifying the economy and so forth. And to me, I don't have the answer, by the way. I just have now a way of looking at it. I think maybe we all need to rethink how we look at the concept of diversification, because we're all approaching it from the Western perspective. And the Western perspective is basically, it's a perspective of countries that don't have a commodity-based income. They all derive, the income of all the Western countries is driven from taxes. And so therefore you have the private sector is the pool from which the government, whether individuals or businesses, from which the government makes its revenues. So in a way, they drive the economy. With us, it's the other way around. And so therefore, every diversification effort you see, even in the region, if you look at anywhere in the region, when they diversify away from oil into renewables, it's the government doing it everywhere you look at it. And so I think, I don't know the answer yet, I'm still working at it, but I think we need to think a different way, because our businesses derive, most of them, from government spending, as the other way around in the West. And all the expertise that comes to us from the West comes from that perspective. And you basically, how can you convince a government with a bureaucracy to think like private sector? I mean, I sat in a meeting once where you have an expert discussing, and they recommended creating a private sector ministry to address its private sector issues. And I thought to myself, well, I mean, bureaucracy, all it does creates more and more bureaucracy. If like anybody who's seen yes prime minister knows the answer.
Great points. Thank you very much indeed. I'll probably call it an end here. I could go on about transformation economies, and maybe that could give Iraq some takeout from here. But I'd like to thank Frank in particular for writing the report, which you can find on the Iraq Britain Business website. You'll also be orating it, I think, at our Mansion House conference. Thank you very much, Frank. And Ahmed Tabaqchali, thank you very much for coming in as a third-party matador, if you like, to respond to Frank. Thank you for your insights and wisdoms. And I'm not sure I'm hearing from you again, but hopefully you can read your report on the LSE that's published on the website as well. Thank you both very much. I hope to see everybody at the Mansion House on the 2nd of July. We also have a great reception on the 1st of July in the evening with heritage and all sorts of things going on. So look forward to seeing you all then. Register through our website. And I'm not sure what our next event is, but I think it's definitely the conference. So thank you all very much indeed for coming, and see you all in due course. Thank you.
Well, thank you on my end. Again, a pleasure being with you, Frank. Take care.
Thank you.
Thank you.